Hi everyone. Today we're going to look at one of the more popular classic Doctor Who fan theories about unseen adventures of the Second Doctor. That's right, today we're going to be talking about the Season 6B theory. Now, stay with me for this one, because it's going to get a little crackpot and a lot crazy. So buckle up. So, the Season 6B theory, in short, is a concept that clears up several ambiguities and apparent contradictions in regard to the Second Doctor's timeline. The theory was first detailed by Paul Cornell, Martin Day, and Keith Topping in the landmark Doctor Who reference book, The Discontinuity Guide. And by the way, if you're at all interested in Doctor Who canon, this is an essential book to own. But to sum it up briefly, Season 6B is the theory that there exist adventures of the Second Doctor that happen after the War Games, his final televised story, but before the Third Doctor's first appearance in Spearhead from Space. Now, at first, the end of the War Games seems to preclude this possibility, as his forced regeneration seemingly happens immediately after his trial. However, there's a fair amount of evidence to suggest that there's an unseen gap in the Doctor's adventures here, and this gap serves nicely to clear up several issues relating to the Second Doctor's later screen appearances in The Five Doctors and The Two Doctors, for example. In order to understand the Season 6B theory, it's important that you understand the end of the War Games. In case you haven't seen it, here's a quick summary. In order to resolve the crisis of the story, the Doctor needs to resort to turning to the Time Lords for help, despite the fact that he's been on the run from them since at least the beginning of the series. So, basically, the Time Lords are able to resolve the crisis, but at the same time, they finally got a hold of the Doctor, a wanted fugitive. Once the situation's dealt with, they erase his companions' memories of their travels with him and drop them off in their proper places in time. Then the Doctor himself is immediately put on trial for breaking the Time Lord's policy of non-interference in time. He is sentenced to a forced regeneration and exile on Earth. As the audience is led to believe the Doctor's regeneration has begun, the credits roll. The next time we see the Doctor, he's freshly regenerated into the Third Doctor at the start of Spearhead from Space. The theory is that, essentially, these two events might not have been one after another as it seems, that there's a gap of time between the Doctor's trial and the regeneration. But before I go any further, there's something I want to get out of the way early. I kinda wish there was a different name for this theory. It's called Season 6B, since it deals with the hypothetical gap of time between Season 6 and 7 of Doctor Who. But to me, Season 6B just sounds like it's a missing season of the show, when in most interpretations of the theory, the gap itself is probably a lengthy period of time that would cover more than just a season worth of adventures. But with this theory having existed for as long as it has, getting people to call it something else would be a considerable effort. Just a little soapbox of mine. But onward. So, it's kinda strange how this theory begins. It's interesting that the first ever implication that the Second Doctor had post-War Games adventures came almost as soon as the Second Doctor left TV screens. Polystyle Publications, the publisher that produced the Doctor Who comic strips in the 60s and 70s, was placed in an awkward spot by Patrick Troughton's departure. Unlike the transition from William Hartnell to Troughton, which had only a normal week-long gap between episodes, Doctor Who was about to enter a hiatus with no new Doctor coming to base the comic strips on for several months. Rather than also put the highly popular comic strip on hold as well, Polystyle made the decision to simply carry on using the Second Doctor. Although, rather than just set these continuing adventures at a point prior to the War Games, they bizarrely chose to explain that the Doctor had begun his exile on Earth and was awaiting the Time Lords to carry out the rest of his sentence. But as Doctor Who went on, these comic strips were largely forgotten, and generally no one takes them into account in modern interpretations of the theory. However, I felt they deserved a mention in this video, as these strips were something of a progenitor of this theory that may have given the later fans the idea. The comic strips aside, the Season 6B theory didn't really register on a lot of fans' radars until the 20th anniversary special, The Five Doctors. A scene towards the end of The Five Doctors sees the second Doctor confronted with an illusion of his companions Jamie and Zoe. When he realizes it's a trap, he says something that doesn't seem strange at first, but upon further thought doesn't really add up.
You're not real. When you were returned to your own people, the Time Lords erased your memory of the period you spent with me. So how do you know who we are?
He realizes it's a trap because the illusions recognize him, despite the fact that the Time Lords have erased their memories of their travels with him. So, therefore, he deduces they can't really be his companions if they recognize him. This is peculiar when you realize that, as shown in the War Games, his companions' memories were erased within moments of the Doctor's regeneration. So, how could he have known about his companions' memories being erased, and then still gone on to have the adventures shown in The Five Doctors, without there being some kind of gap there? It made fans start to scratch their heads. Not to mention, the second Doctor shows up in The Five Doctors without any companions. At no point in the second Doctor's televised tenure were there any points at which he didn't have anyone else traveling with him. So this further corroborates the idea that this takes place for him in an unseen period of time during his life as the second Doctor. Now the two Doctors, Patrick Troughton's final appearance in the role, expands on the theory considerably. He explains in this serial that he's acting as a sort of deniable agent of the Time Lords, so that they could interfere in temporal events without seeming as though they themselves were behind it. Since the Time Lords officially had a policy of non-interference in the rest of the universe's affairs, any time they wished to actually do so, like a hypocrite, they could send the Doctor as their pawn, since it would directly fit his MO as a wandering time traveler. Given the events of the War Games being the first time the Doctor had returned to Gallifrey, there's no other place in the second Doctor's timeline where this could have taken place apart from after the War Games. The War Games itself makes it very clear that this is the first contact the Doctor has had with his home planet since he first left. So in both the three Doctors and the two Doctors, he appears to be working directly with, if not working for, the Time Lords. As the War Games is definitively the earliest point that the second Doctor re-engages with his people, there's no other way for this to take place in any other era other than between the War Games and Spearhead from Space. Starting to see a pattern here. There's a few other miscellaneous bits of evidence that support the theory. These include the second Doctor and Jamie appearing significantly older in the two Doctors, Jamie himself knowing who the Time Lords are in the two Doctors, meaning that it has to take place after the War Games from his perspective as well. The second Doctor's TARDIS console room is the same one as the sixth Doctor used at the time, despite it never appearing that way during his televised tenure. Obviously, out of universe, this is for budget reasons, but in universe, there's no explanation given. When the third Doctor first shows up in Spearhead from Space, he has several items with him that the second Doctor didn't have, most notably the TARDIS homing watch. This gives the theory that there's unseen adventures in between the two. In the fourth Doctor serial, The Mask of Mandragora, the second Doctor's recorder is found in the secondary console room. Again, this room is never seen during the second Doctor's era, meaning he could have left the recorder there on a later unseen adventure, possibly taking place during Season 6B. Ever since it was first proposed by Cornell, Day, and Topping, the Season 6B theory has been a major point of discussion for fans of the show, and most fans seem to approve of it in regards to explaining the apparent holes in the second Doctor's timeline. What's interesting, though, is that in later years, it seems to have been adopted into the quote-unquote official Doctor Who canon. Yes, I say official in quotes because, as we all know, Doctor Who's canon is absurdly ill-defined, and there's no official word on what is and what is not canon. Season 6B officially made the jump from fan speculation to something established in-universe narrative with a pair of BBC novels from the Past Doctor Adventures range. The first was the Sixth Doctor novel, Players. This novel explains in a flashback that although the Doctor had been sentenced to forced regeneration and exile on Earth, the Time Lords first demanded he act as an agent of theirs, as established by the two Doctors. Players was the first official BBC Doctor Who media to definitively state in black and white that this period of time takes place for the Doctor following his trial in the War Games. While the theory is first established definitively in Players, The novel World Game, released several years later, expands on it considerably. It is, from an in-universe perspective at least, the first Season 6B story, and it actually details the beginning of the Doctor's work for the Time Lords. The premise of the novel is essentially that the Doctor was initially sentenced to death for his crimes, but while the trial is ongoing, the Time Lords notice a temporal interference on Earth and suggest to the Doctor that they will commute his death sentence to one of exile if he agrees to be an expendable agent and deal with this disturbance. The Doctor, of course, agrees, but only on the condition that he can verify that the soldiers that were abducted in the war games were returned to their proper places in space and time. The implication is made that the on-screen depiction of the Doctor's trial in the War Games was the version of events that go down in official Time Lord history, while the events of World Game are what really happened. It's ironic that both of these novels were written by veteran Doctor Who writer Terrance Dicks, since most of the discord regarding the Second Doctor's late appearances can be traced back to him. He co-wrote The War Games, was script editor for The Three Doctors when it was produced, and wrote The Five Doctors. But I guess it's only fitting that the writer who caused most of the confusion should be the one to sort it out. I know it's ambiguous whether or not these novels can be considered canon, but they were official BBC publications that acknowledge the theory, so they're a noteworthy part of discussing it. Perhaps a little more convincingly, the now archived Classic Series episode guide on the BBC's old website does in fact include an entry for Season 6B, so it's safe to say that the official stance is that it does indeed exist. So that's about all there is to say on the subject. With the drought of classic media starting to come to an end, and the occasional novel featuring a classic Doctor surfacing nowadays, I'd like to hope that more Season 6B content could be coming our way in the future. I also kinda wish Big Finish could do more with it, but seeing as they're limited in the Second Doctor stories they can tell, I can't really blame them for not having many. In any case, this was a fun topic to cover. Thanks for listening to what I have to say. I know it got confusing in parts here and there, and have a great day.